I've been trying to trace a paradox. Poetry is wonderfully complicated. It's a verbal idiom that creates a certain intensity around expression, either with rhythms or grammatical absences or alliterations and so on. And you can't easily isolate these factors from the expression in which they exercise their specific agency. It makes poetry hard to analyse, but especially hard to generalise. What makes one poem seem so lovely or powerful doesn't have any apparent counterpart in another poem which might be lovely or powerful for different reasons. We write poetically to add an unusual or poignant dimension to an utterance. It might be to add colour or invite multiple interpretations in the words themselves, to leaven an utterance with more possibilities. Poets are sometimes mischievously ambiguous, a bit like people who tell jokes. They might finger at the meaning in a ticklish way, or they might grab it in a bear hug. Sometimes sly, sometimes sanguine, sometimes logical, sometimes hysterical. It's a serious game of resonances that stimulates emotional reactions that you don't easily come by through conventional communication in prose. Prose, of course, can be very poetic. You've probably encountered heaps of it that you remember more vividly than certain poems that you've read, even in Shakespeare, whose prose is scintillating. And so that makes the definition of poetry doubly difficult, because the distinction with its counterpart prose is vague. Of all the imponderables and obscurities of poetry, the one element that should be rational, consistent, simple and obvious is metre. According to the very name, it's measurable. But this simple empirical part generates little enough agreement. Upon critical inspection, it turns out to be obscure and noisy, and that from the very first epoch when metre was discussed among the Greeks. I don't want to blame the Greeks and their apologists for the messiness of metre, because after so many centuries of our own tonically accented development, which everyone agrees is much simpler, we should have been able to sort things out for ourselves. But the great indisposition lingers. Readers are confused, and then the whole thing looks too hard to revive, even for a performance of Shakespeare. And given the challenges of the non-technical side of poetry, all the good stuff about meaning where all the interpretative rewards lie, who's going to redeem metre from the mess of its noble historical muddle? Another way of putting it is that the Greeks invented the dysfunctionality of metre, and we have fulfilled it. But the final part of my theory that I wanted to test with you is this: the same greying out of stress that's necessarily propagated by Greek metrics is also helpful in negotiating some of the metrical awkwardness that sometimes arises in our own language. In the last video, I raised the point that English words with an antepenultimate stress don't submit to an iambic beat. So that means words like indelible, treacherous, thoughtfulness, consummate, penalty, and they can't be used or not without great awkwardness. But that isn't the only problem. The iambic beat is also messed up by great poets who sometimes put a more robust syllable at the start of the foot rather than the end. I think that it sometimes makes sense, and I can't absolutely rule out the idea that Shakespeare, say, sometimes wanted us to start with a trochee. An example is the final line of Macbeth's breathtaking soliloquy: signifying nothing. You have to scan it trocheically, signifying nothing. And look, it's justified because in a way it preserves the iambic beat as if by musical anacrusis, because the line immediately before ends with the feminine fury, and so a perfect line of iambic pentameter could be bent around the break, of sound and fury signifying nothing. So I guess that there are cases where suddenly Shakespeare will use a trochee. What I can't accept is that he'll use a dactyl dumpty. So let's go back to that line, the line above, signifying nothing, which I'll recite in prose, told by an idiot, full of sound and fury. Metrists call this an inversion, and the expectation is that you emphasise the first syllable. I don't accept this label of inversion. To me, it's a regular iambic line, and to support my conviction, I call upon those same Greeks who messed up metre to solve our problem. I'm steadfastly going to scan the line iambically. Told by an idiot full of sound and fury. When I say our problem, it's a big problem in the field. All metrists are scrupulous, and one Goswin König counted up the numbers. According to him, the Shakespearean corpus has a strong pattern of inversions, mostly on the first foot of the line, of which there are some 3,000. There are only about a tenth the number on the second foot. The third and fourth feet are also candidates, but nothing like as much as the first. Well, that's a forbidding number, and if you put it like that, it sure looks as if Shakespeare often really did like the emphasis on the first syllable. But it could simply be that because you haven't set the rhythm up in your head when you begin the line. I don't acknowledge these inversions. If there's any discomfort in the rhythm, I employ the grey that you learn from the Greeks, so that the stress and syllabic length can leaven one another and neither punches the other one out. So I say, told by an idiot full of sound and fury. I give the told a bit of length by drawing out the diphthong, told, but then place the stress on the by, and you can preserve the beat and still not distort the natural pronunciation. So let me take some examples, famous ones of inversion, where I'll have no difficulty scanning them iambically. Sleek-headed men and such as sleep o' nights. Grim-visaged war hath smoothed his wrinkled front. All-seeing heaven, what a world is this? They're beautiful lines, instanced as inversions by Otto Jespersen in 1900, who had a clever but unnecessary scale of stress, and in all his examples he assigns the highest stress to the first syllable. But they're all flawlessly iambic. Let's just go through some more. Urge neither charity nor shame to me. Die neither mother, wife, nor England's queen. Peace, Master Marquess, you are malapert. Peace, children, peace, the king doth love you well. First, madam, I entreat true peace of you. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. Foul wrinkled witch, what makest thou in my sight? Long mayest thou live to wail thy children's death. Grief fills the room up of my absent child. God will revenge it, come lords, will you go? Their woes are parcelled, mine is general. And while we're at it, let's do the German lines that Jespersen cites. Dank habt ihr stets, doch nicht den reinen Dank. Wohl dem, der seiner Vater gern gedenkt. Ihn freut der Besitz, ihn krönt der Sieg. There's no need to say Dank habt ihr stets or wohl dem. Those lines all scan in impeccable iambic fashion, and just because a second "een" gets the stress, it doesn't mean that the first one has to. You actually don't need much grey on any of those examples. Where you need it, more to our modern ear is where the first two syllables form a single word. Doomsday is near, die all, die merrily. Welcome, Sir Walter Blunt, and would to God England did never owe so sweet a hope. Something that hath a reference to my state. If you recognise it as iambic pentameter, then you can read it as iambic pentameter, neither confounding the rhythm with an alien foot, nor warping the natural sound of the word. If you employ some grayness, and you'll only need it occasionally, you don't need to recognise any inversions. The toughest lines can all be kept to the beat with just a few shades of grey. English has changed a bit since the Renaissance. It isn't a stable language like Greek. Over time the stress can shift. One used to say balcony, whereas now we only ever say balcony. But in the 18th century, one writer recorded that the new pronunciation of balcony that had evidently crept in during his lifetime makes me sick. I say decade, but some people say decade. It doesn't really make me sick, but English is labile. I see plenty of lines in old poetry that testify to this kind of equivocation, where an old romance stress survives or is called back from archaic measures to give an iambic beat. An example, I'll say it first in prose. Cowards die many times before their deaths. Now, cowards, if it were pronounced cowards, sounds to me like a remnant from French, couard, and Italian, codardo, and Spanish, cobarde, but where the second syllable is always accented, but the word has travelled so far that the echo is entirely lost and you'd only ever encounter cowards. So you're going to need a lot of grey here to allow an ultimate stress to flow through the word. My advice is to think of the sentiment that the poetry expresses and use the grey elongations to supplement or exaggerate the meaning. In the case of cowards, the sentiment is contempt, because cowards are weak and mortified before danger, and so you can growl and hiss that word out in a way that argues your scorn. Cowards die many times before their death. And of course, I'm also using grey on die and many, so that they also conform to the beat. The type that I've tackled here is the hardest that you'll ever come across, and they're still cropping up in Tennyson. Actors are capable of pressing these words into an iambic shape without excessively distorting the sound or meaning, maybe even enhancing the meaning. The technique, which we don't need too often because most of our poets are regular enough, can be grafted from ancient convention by which the Greeks ran their dactylic beat through the wrong syllables, many times in each line. At the end of the day, I don't think that having a wonky rhythm is as bad as having no rhythm at all. It's better to work some grey latitude into the stress than to eliminate the regularities of the beat, because what might appear to be an anomalous pronunciation, if it only occurs here or there and is handled with expressive greyness, can enhance the semantic agency of the text. You can't do it all the time, and you won't need to. In Greek, you need to do it all the time, because the convention was messed up by music and predicated on a partnership with the lyre that wasn't sustainable through the voice alone. So it all has to be either falsely accented or greyed out to keep the beat going. In English, however, we can use grey judiciously on those few occasions where our poets demand a stress inconsistent with our mother's pronunciation. And sometimes it even improves the recitation. These notes, I guess, are directed to actors who perform English poetry. But what of authors who write English poetry instead? I think I touched on this in the last video. How possible is it still to write metrically in our language? The problem, on top of all the obscurities that we've charted, is that poets in English have also inherited a dominant verse scheme, iambic pentameter, that's fundamentally unsuited to modern English. It's too slow for modern speech and eliminates a large proportion of our vocabulary. All words with an antepenultimate stress, for goodness sakes. But our problem has been that iambic pentameter is hallowed from Chaucer to Rossetti and still creeping into T.S. Eliot, and that very mystique still seduces metrical poets, alas persuades them that that's all there is in our tongue. Well, it isn't. You can easily add another syllable in each foot, and some poets did. In the 16th century, when the French were beginning to find their comfort in the spacious Alexandrine, an English poet, Thomas Tusser, produced verse in amphibrachic tetrameter, where there are 3 syllables per foot rather than 2. That means that it goes 50% faster by the same beat. Good landlord who findeth is blessed of God. A cumbersome landlord is husbandman's rod. He noyeth, destroyeth, and all to his drift, to strip his poor tenant of farm and of thrift. It isn't always resonant poetry like what you might remember in Shakespeare or Dryden, but the metre is racy. How it skips along, maybe even a bit merrily, and perhaps that's its flaw. The French Alexandrine, which is an anapestic tetrameter, perhaps thanks to its lovely long syllables, has plenty of gravitas. But in transferring the majestic line to English, Tusser shears off a syllable from the first foot so that the tetrameter isn't anapestic but amphibrachic. The gap at the beginning makes it sound a bit chirpy and complacent even when the content is laudable. Each day to be feasted, what husbandry worse? Each day for to feast is as ill for the purse. Yet measurely feasting with neighbours among shall make thee beloved and live the more long. Quite witty metre, spacing out the juxtapositions, eh? But perhaps more jocular than monumental. Anyway, let's not complain about Tusser's invention, because it was neither taken up nor adapted. It didn't take hold, even though the quicker pace could easily have been developed in a tasteful regular Alexandrine or some other number of feet. So, with few exceptions, English poets writing blank verse or rhyming couplets stuck to their iambic pentameter, which is death slow and disqualifies words with an antepenultimate stress. Now, we don't have to cry, because the Alexandrine in French, which is so speedy yet stately and versatile, also perished not long after Baudelaire. There were other reasons for the demise of metre in all Western languages, which we touched upon in the last video. It wasn't just because we had the speed settings wrong. It was the very concept of metre. I guess you could say that it had run its course. But you could also say that its failure was fulfilled. Metre began dying from the day it was born in ancient Greece. It was a system of pulses imposed on language by the logic of music that ran almost independently of the natural stress of Greek words. It arose by the compelling rhythmic sway of music, but had no basis in the logic of Greek language to sustain it naturally as an intuitive, natural, autonomous art. And so an artificial scaffold, quantitative metre, was created as if there were a higher purpose in the archaic rhythms rather than something accidentally forced on it. The idea of poetry was born together with an unsustainable pretension. And although quantitative metre was abandoned from later Byzantium, its accentual replacements to the Industrial Revolution were ghosted by the obscurities of the classical past, and the confidence in a regular rhythm was destined to flag. We have some rollicking good rhythms in our modern languages, but we don't have any love for them. Greek quantitative metre was the first that was hard to love, adored only by hardcore philologists, but the disaffection that was there from early days would catch up with the practice in succeeding epochs. Either metre is difficult to fathom and impossible to pronounce, or it's happy-clappy sing-song stuff for the unsophisticated. You're either ashamed of your ignorance or embarrassed by your taste. And in an epoch that's in any case not over fond of archaic rituals, of course we've overwhelmingly let it slip. Metre is sporadically employed by competent poets and always has the potential to enjoy a revival. I certainly hope so, but probably only when the shibboleth of quantitative metre is deconstructed and the expressive wonders of rhythmical speech are rediscovered afresh.